Hello and welcome to our next session of Politics of Code. Today we want to focus on another aspect of exploitation and self-determination, which has to do with how property and the idea of creation or authorship is changed through technology, and in particular through digital technology. Exploitation and digital technology have a long history together, and it's a really wide field that we will touch in several of our classes here. You might remember the last section on identity and language, kind of this colonial and imperialist versus also the universalist claim of digital technology with the example of, for example, the ASCII code. So this was one thing. Then there's another one that has been mentioned throughout the course already that we will focus a bit later on a bit more closely, which is precarious work. So people, for example, creating the raw material of mining the raw material for our electronic devices are of course living mostly in really horrible conditions in often politically unsafe zones. For example, in parts of the Congo where there is civil unrest and so buying electronic devices directly finances war atrocities in places not only in Africa but also in Latin America. So this is a second part, and then a third part, of course, is the precarious work in the army of mechanical Turks. This has also been mentioned already in the big data section. So you can sign up as a mechanical Turk and then, for example, do image recognition work for Google, telling Google what is on an image. I mean, every one of us is constantly forced to do this unpaid for work with these capture images that Google forces us to click, for example, on this is a traffic light, or this is a pedestrian crossing and whatever. So all these that is unpaid for work that we have to fulfill in order for Google to make their image recognition algorithms better. We will look at that even in particular looking at that as exploitative work that people get paid for sometimes really little money and are forced into these depending positions when we look a bit closer into how machine learning works. So today we want to focus on a part that is usually not directly seen as a problem of labor. It is the creative work, and kind of misunderstanding of what creative work is in a society and in an economy has a long history. So if we go back about 200 years, this is when it all starts, so to say. So here is the beautiful opening of the book Jerusalem by William Blake. So if you look at this opening poem in the preface, it is a very powerful hymn that he wrote, starting with, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem built here among these dark satanic mills?" Yeah, so this is a really interesting kind of dialectical opposition. So you have the beautiful green pastures of England on the one hand and the dark satanic mills, and still the question, is England, as William Blake here proposes, the new Jerusalem is kind of the place where the second coming will take place, and so on. I mean, this is a religious context that we won't focus here so much. But what did he mean with this black satanic mills? Jerusalem, this poem, is the longest and probably the most beautiful of Blake's writings, and is particularly a beautifully illustrated book. So Blake made these watercolor illustrated pages. So it's 100 watercolor plates and more than 5,000 verses of poetry in this lamentation of how much the world has decayed, actually, and how that kind of indicates that Satan comes and the beast of Babylon is rising and all these apocalyptic thinkings. So it was written in the first 20 years of the 19th century. So that was a time of great changes. So first of all, there was the Napoleonic War. So England was pretty much cut off the continent and left to their own devices, and which pushed them further out into their colonial empires, because they couldn't do much on the continent because the French would kind of keep them away. But on the other hand, it was the time when industrialization took off. So the steam engine had just started to become a means of replacing work with capital. So here you see the one of the earliest of these industrial production sites that was steam powered. It is a flour mill. It's the so-called Albion flour mills on the south banks of the Thames in London. So this flour mill was the first in the world steam-powered mill. It was incredibly capital intensive. It was hundreds of thousands of pounds that were invested to have this the machinery and the skilled work in place, and it soon became by far the largest mill in the world. I mean, to grind so much wheat into flour as never has been seen before. And by that, I mean, that is a really interesting thing what happened. The mill was so much more productive, and the flour could be produced so much cheaper that on the one hand, the mill owners could pay the farmers delivering the corn a bit more than their competitors could. So they would basically push out of business all the competition in the mill business. And on the other hand, they would completely monopolize the flour market very quickly, in London at least, or in southeast England. And by that could raise the price for flour significantly on the consumer side. And people would be really angry about that. And sorry. And so it didn't take long, and someone put fire on the mills and they burned down and everything ended. And it was, as you see in this caricature of the newspaper that came out like a day or two later after the fire in 1791, people really cheering. So while the firefighters try to put the fire out, people are cheering and welcoming that the devilish thing of the Albion mill would finally end. So this is the black satanic mill that Blake belabors, that Blake sees as the threat, as this kind of apocalyptic sign that changes England forever, and of course soon the rest of the world. And in particular, it is the form of labor that takes place inside, as we shall see. This is another of Blake's plates from the same book, so where he sees London blind-aged, bent, begging through the streets. So London is this old man being led by the child of Babylon. Tears run down his beard. So what Blake stands for is a totally new form of art at his time. At around 1800, it is Romanticism. So Romanticism is, so the word Romanticism comes from French. It has the word Roman in it, and that is no surprise. So as romantique, in the late medieval times or early Renaissance times, or maybe like 500 years ago, people would call romantic pieces of literature that were not in Latin, but in the langue romaine, in the Roman language, which is the vernacular that then would become French. or Italian in Italy. So that's the vernacular language, the language of plain people. And people would write totally different stories in their vernacular language. They would no longer talk about God and the knights and kind of the theological or the great deeds of the kings or whatever. So it's a totally different form of literature that would speak about plain people's things, like, for example, love and tragedy of maybe faithlessness and people leaving their loved ones because they have to go to war, and all these stories that we think of as romantic started at that time. And so in over the time, this genre of telling love stories that way was more and more connected with this idea of being in the Roman language. So this is the name of Romanticism. And around 1800, that becomes very strong. So it has many reasons. One is this discovery of national identity that comes in Europe at that time very strongly through the French Revolution. It's a totally different story. Here we talked about identity already. One of the people driving this idea of national identity and language was the German philosopher and linguist Friedrich von Schlieger. So Schlegel is, notable also as a poet. I mean, he is the most quoted translator of Shakespeare's works from English into German. He was speaking many languages, and he is in particular the first European who discovered the similarities between Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, and German. So, and he saw that. I mean, he was one of the first people, I guess, in Europe really to learn Sanskrit, and he read the Vedic literature and other ancient scriptures of India, and understood that these languages, German and Hindi, would be very closely connected over their common ancestor, Sanskrit. So he coined the term of the Indo-Germanic languages, which we call nowadays Indo-European languages. And he said, well, there is a common ancestor, and that is people who lived at that time, like 3,000 years ago, in India, that called themselves Aryans. So this is another interesting kind of point in time, and this idea of national identity of Germanism was defined, and this connection with the Aryans, which we now think have been people more from Iran than from India, had been brought together. So Schlegel is also credited with first using the word Romanticism for the new form of art, for which William Blake is one of the first proponents. So Romanticist art sees the world with different eyes. Romanticism sees that there is something out there which we call nature, and nature is different from us. So the nature could be, for example, a forest, and if we go into the forest, we get lost. There might be evil creatures in the forest, or there is something like the sea, and if we go out the sea, there might be a storm, and we might get lost on the sea. And also, there is something in ourselves that we don't know, some dark side of us that makes us angry, for example. That's the nature in ourselves that we can't control. And the Romanticists were very interested in this opposition of this nature that is uncontrollable for humans, and this fight for staying alive, for having control, and for having culture as the opposite of nature. And that was not visible to people earlier in Europe. I mean, people were kind of struggling with their lives anyway, and there were not that many people in the first place. So it didn't make sense for people to differentiate culture and nature. There was just one thing. I mean, you had your city life or your village life, and then you would go out in the forest, and things were wild there. But that was not seen as an opposition. While in the Romanticism, nature was pretty much tamed. The forests were cut down. There were many people living. There was industrialization. So everything was starting to be turned into raw material that used to be nature. So nature becomes a resource, as Heidegger 100 years later would then say. So for example, we start seeing, for example, rivers no longer be nature and untamed wild, but they become a resource of power, for example, or for transport. And that goes very far. So this commodification of nature makes nature something of romantic projection. So you see it as something valuable in which you would kind of project your dreams, your hopes, and kind of your utopian ideas. And with this commodification that Romanticism tries to somehow fights off, comes also a very strong turn towards the individual. So Romanticism is the time like around 1800, when in Europe and in the US at the same time, the idea of the individual as being kind of responsible for themselves starts to take place. And it has also to do with the change in power and in economy. I mean, in the feudal times before, there was a landlord, and the landlord, I mean, you owed basically everything, your life, and so to the landlord you wouldn't have private property, and you wouldn't consider yourself as being an individual. I mean, what would that mean? Even you would live in a village, you would know everyone in the village, but you would never think of yourself as being special. You are just one of many. I mean, even if you have an individual name or so. So that was the time of feudalism. In feudalism, I mean, also this is true for educated people, for people up the ranks. There was very little person behind people. I mean, if you look at how stories are told from before, say, 1700, like 300 years ago, about, for example, the rulers, you never hear personal anecdotes or so. It is just telling very matter-of-factly about their position. And it changes, so the individual, the person, gets personality, gets its own responsibility, and that has to do also with people leaving the countryside. I mean, in England, for example, the bonded serfdom gets abandoned, and people are free to move. That was not out of generosity of the aristocracy. No, it was because for the aristocrats it became much more lucrative, instead of growing crops, to herd sheep, because the wool and the textile that they made from the wool would produce much higher yields. So that is the change in society that happens between 1700 and 1800, and that is much pushed by the steam engine, because the steam engine makes it possible to have steam-powered weaver looms and to ramp up textile creation to unknown extents. So you need a workforce to operate these machines. You need laborers. And this is people from the countryside leaving for the cities and working in the factories. And these people were no longer kind of taken care of by their landlord. They were free now, but they were also free to sell their labor on the market. And that is when thinkers of early socialism, and then Karl Marx, around 1830, start seeing this problem that labor itself becomes a commodity. Yeah, and this is what Marx writes in the Capital. So the commodity is no longer measured by its utility value. It's abstracted into a monetary value, into exchange value. And by that a totally new class of work, so to say, exists, which is work in the financial world. And you can immediately see the choice that, for example, a capitalist, a factory owner, or a craftsperson who employs people can make now between investing into machines that would produce continuously the yield, or feeding people that they employ, which get sick and might just run away, and so on. So you have suddenly a substitution between labor and capital, and that is the early Marxist point. The interesting thing, however, is that at the same time, the creative work also starts to become commodified. So what we see is a change from art being completely in the social service, like, for example, painting churches or other religious buildings, painting or decorating municipal or royal buildings or so. It becomes privatized, it becomes turned into commodities. And that is what happened between the 18th and the 20th century. And there's two German philosophers who saw that in a very analytical way in the early 20th century. One is Walter Benjamin, whom we encounter frequently across interactive media courses, and the other is Theodor Adorno. Adorno was Benjamin's, I guess, closest friend, and is after the Second World War. Walter Benjamin took his life in 1942, and then after Second World War, Adorno took Benjamin's academic inheritance and made it widely known by re-establishing the critical theory. So Adorno is one of the founding fathers of what we today call the critical school. And he is a very strong critic of any kind of industrially produced culture. So this is what he sees coming out of this whole process. So we have the role of music as being completely commodified. It gets changed from something that people do at home or at church where they sing together, or at a kind of at a public gathering where people make music and then other people dance to that or whatever, to something that gets sold. And we will look into how technology plays a role on that. However, the artist gets stylized as a totally supernatural creature at the same time as the creator. I mean, in times before 1800, artists were hardly known by name. I mean, an architect, for example, would be just seen as a craftsperson. A painter was just a craftsperson. They would be paid by the hour. And of course by the material that they would use. But around 1800 that changes. We have these intense individuals, these artists who are driven, this cliche of the genius artist who is so strongly motivated that he has to leave everything for his creation. I mean, you hear in the word creation that it is even blasphemic. I mean, if you think of that time, or if you're a religious person, I mean, there's only one creator probably, and that is certainly not a human being. And by calling artists creators, I mean, you completely mix that up and say they are so creative, I mean, really like a god. So this Promethean drive behind the art. And by that, I mean, totally, I mean, kind of elevating authorship to something that is beyond normal day-to-day work. And that is important to know because it has directly to do with not properly paying people. And because the only person who is properly paid in that game is the publisher. So the poet is stylized as being kind of this painting here by Spitzweg from my hometown in Munich. So the poor poet from 1839. I mean, he can't really do paid for work because he has to he lives in the books, and he doesn't care that there is rain coming through. So this is a romanticization. This is, of course, propaganda. This is, the artists, they get their reward in a different way because the audience loves them and things like that. So that is enough excuse for exploitation. I mean, who exploits the artists? I mean, it's the publishers. So the publishers are the ones who get the money. And you see that here in Adorno's, really infamous piece on jazz. So unfortunately, Adorno hated anything that was created by the cultural industry so much that he totally got wrong many things. I come to that in a second. But if you see that, so the capital power of the publisher, it's dissemination through radio and above all sound film have cultivated a tendency towards centralization, which limits the freedom of choice and barely allows for any real competition. So this is an interesting one, because this is what happens in early cinema. So cinema gets, within very few years after it starts, around 1900, completely centralized into very few hands of people who make movies. And it has to do with it is expensive to make movies. There's a lot of risk behind it. And you need distribution, you need marketing. So there is huge economies of scale in making movies. So you need a lot of money beforehand, before even starting with a movie. You have to pay people, you have to pay the screenwriter, you have to pay the actors, and so on. So movie is a business that's very capital intensive, that gets centralized, that gets monopolized in very few hands. And that is what created Hollywood. Hollywood is, so to say, the Silicon Valley of the 1920s. I mean, it is fueled by people who have excess money, who put their money into film productions as kind of a risk investment, as venture capital. And that's how the cultural industry of Hollywood starts. And of course, Adorno is totally wrong. I mean, there is, among the best works of art created in the 20th century, among the movies made in Hollywood, and made by other cultural industry outlets, by other major studios. So it's not true that only worthless crap comes out of that process. And in particular, if you look, Adorno's hatred against jazz music, because it is commodified music, it's an early form of what then would become pop music. It's also totally wrong. There's nothing as such crappy about pop music other than it is a weird kind of conundrum that you would have kind of this counterculture of the pop musician and then have this total mass market that is again dominated by only a handful of publishers that basically monopolize all the music sales. So this is something that we have to make sense of. This is technologically driven exploitation of most of all the musicians. It's very few that actually make music, or almost everything that is done in movies and so on in the 20th century. So here we have technology that's centralized. We have the recording, the distribution. So this is very expensive. Until certain inventions were made in the late 20th century, that suddenly makes it very easy to record yourself. And that is, in particular, the cassette tape. So the cassette tape is the first mass available means of storage for music. It was invented in the mid-1970s by a research team led by Lou Frederick Ottens. So Ottens was born in the Netherlands in 1926 and was an engineer at Philips in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and he just died on March 6 this year. So it's kind of makes an end to that story in a way, in a very poetic way. So we have the tape, and this logo that we see here, this campaign. When I was a child in 1980, this was printed on almost every record. So taping kills music and it's illegal. What happened is that the music industry suddenly lost their monopoly position about distributing music. People could just take music themselves, I mean, recording their own music, but also, I mean, of course, taping music that came in the radio or just making tapes from their records and remixing that. And what starts is the DJ culture of mixing music and making new music by taking collages of old music. And the music industry hated that and tried everything to keep that down. I mean, with the tapes, the distribution is still very limited. I mean, you make one tape and then how do you copy it? I mean, that is quite difficult. I mean, it takes a lot of time to copy tapes. So unless you have a professional production studio for that. It was not that much of a threat. However, you see, I mean, how powerful the tapes were in the Gulf region, in the Iranian Revolution. So what happened starting in the late 70s is that the revolutionary leader Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile in France, would record messages, his voice, I mean prayers and inciting revolutionary messages that were copied inside music. So they were incredibly hard to find. I mean, because you had to listen through all the tape to find this inciting revolutionary call. And they were distributed in the hundreds of thousands. So people copied them and distributed all over Iran. And the CIA, for example, had no idea that that would happen. And so it came as a total surprise that the Iranian revolutionary forces would have been so well organized all of a sudden and would just send away the CIA dictator, the Shah of Persia. And then, of course, create the regime that is still in power in Iran to this day. So that is the role of music tape, which is an incredibly powerful kind of changing technology to distribute culture. Yeah, so home taping didn't kill music really. It's more that tapes died out all of themselves. Funny enough, I mean, these abandoned tapes I found here outside here in Abu Dhabi at the NYU sports field, lying around here. Even if you think of tapes being long dead, I mean, still you find remnants of that in the desert. So why did tapes end? I mean, the reason we all know is digital. Digital copies of music are so much more convenient, and unfortunately, digital things you can copy without loss in quality, so you can make unlimited copies of whatever you want. And a second thing happens with the availability of digital culture. Suddenly, everything is at your fingertips. I mean, on the internet, most of the culture is permanently available. If I, for example, am interested in playing a piano piece, I don't only, I'm not limited to, for example, listen to one record that I might own, or then look at the score music and trying to figure that out myself, how it is to be played as that would have been in the 19th century. No, I can just go on YouTube and find like hundreds, if not thousands of people, amateurs, who play that music, and even maybe introduce me into how they kind of interpret it and so on. And everything is there. I mean, recordings from the 1930s, from the 1950s, and so I can just choose whatever style I want and kind of make that my own. So this is what we find on YouTube, and that is of course not all. There is so many things that didn't exist at all before YouTube. All these strange videos that people make, very vernacular culture. So this is the second kind of heavy blow that the cultural industry, of course, received about 20 years ago, when that started to become really a thing. And I mean, of course, I mean, already in the early times of digital publishing, people ran into difficulties with this. So this is a story that I remember very well. It happened in Germany. There is this family who has their family blog. I mean, a blog was a quite common thing at the time. There were all kinds of platforms that you could just post your things. There was no Twitter yet, or it was hardly invented at that time. So you would basically run your own blog with your name on it, of course. I mean, and you would be responsible what's on it. And so someone here, this family, they would post a picture of a glass of iced tea. However, they didn't make that picture themselves. They took it from the internet. And someone claimed the copyright for that picture and sued them for 3,000 euros in compensation for this illegitimate and unlicensed use of their intellectual property. This is another case. The sandwich. This is the actual picture. So someone used that picture again on their blog. I mean, just to say, well, sometimes it didn't even have to do anything with recipes or anything like that. And the person was again subpoenaed for 3,000 euros in compensation. So, and the site behind the two photos, I mean, that posted these photos and made them available through Google, was a site called Marion's Kochbuch, so Marion's Cookbook. And within like a few weeks, the owner of that site, which was a law firm, would send out 2,500 subpoenas and earn millions in kind of these, I mean, really outrageous claims of copyright infringements. So what people learned the hard way, in a very painful way at that time, is there is no non-commercial use of art anymore. I mean, in the 19th and 20th century, I mean, if you wanted to have a picture, you had to pay someone to get it. It had to be physically acquired. There was no good way of copying that. In the 20th century, that changed. You could at least make a photo of the picture, but still, I mean, you would basically, if you kept that to yourself, you would have what is now called fair use. You would just use it for yourself. You wouldn't gain any money by that. I mean, that would of course be different if you go into a museum and make a picture of someone's art and then publish a book by that. I mean, that was always a thing that people would then request royalties for, and I think that's right. But now it's different. Now everyone can accidentally infringe other people's copyright. Like, for example, you publish something on YouTube and in the background music is playing. And YouTube has filters on that takes that out, that takes that off. So you better be very careful that there is no music playing in the background if you want to publish a YouTube video. So suddenly there is no non-commercial use anymore. So we have the first step that happens is kind of this questionable idea of the creator, of the creation, of the author that happens in the 19th century at the same time when the industrial commodification of creative work happens. The second step is this kind of end of the original, the kind of infinitely copyable digital file that starts actually with still analog media like the music cassette. So that's the second blow. And the third is this kind of end of the private use, end of the fair use idea. And people oppose to that. So here you see a talk moderated by the artist Adi Wagenknecht. She interviews here Peter Sunde. Peter Sunde is a Finnish-Swedish artist and activist. And Peter started in 2005 a project called the Pirate Bay. And it was an art project, basically. It was a site where people could just upload files to share them. The idea behind that is a very strong belief that art lives through circulation, that art is meant to be shared and reused and repurposed. And that art in the first place is not created by a single creator that like has this inspiration and had this godlike creative ability, but that it is more like society who enables people to become artists, who enables art to be made. And there is a ton of art in history that is the legacy already that people build their own art upon. So what the creation actually is a very tiny step ahead of that. So how much actually do you think that's worth versus, I mean, do you really have the right to sue other people for taking what you think is your creation and using that for themselves? So Peter was questioning these attitudes with his project, the Pirate Bay. And then in 2006 he got arrested and sued with copyright theft by the Swedish prosecutors, and sued by Sony, one of the largest music publishers, kind of pay compensation in the dimensions of like 20 million euros or $20 million or something like that in compensation for the damage that he allegedly had done. And I mean, is that really true? I mean, how much damage do you think the sharing music actually does? And do people really not buy music anymore? I mean, and it's true, artists always struggle, but I mean, how many musicians would make a living before the digital times? I mean, music was always a very hard business, and the only people becoming rich by that were the publishers in the first place. Yeah, and I mean, the arrest and then also the conviction and prison term that Peter served was what brought me to join his friends and other people that were seeing this injustice to form the Pirate Party in 2006. The Pirate Party was a political activist organization that was addressing these changes in economy and society and asking for the law to reflect the reality and the ethics of people instead of conserving 19th and early 20th century property and power relations. Yeah, and finally we end up in this new boom of commodification. So the digital interactive media artist Lindsay Howard is also an activist. I mean, here celebrates on Twitter the creation of their non-fungible token, a blockchain-based financial derivative. We will look into the technology of that in the session on blockchain more in detail. What it does basically is it gives artificial scarcity to something that can be infinitely often reproduced. I mean, the internet is made to copy things infinitely often. I mean, that's the idea of the web browser basically. So you have files on web servers, and the web browser is software that handles the protocol, kind of taking the files that sit on the browser, that's usually HTML, but can be images, music, and whatever multimedia files, and copying that on your local machines to display it. That's exactly what happens in an HTTP call. And you should know that from your foundation classes in interactive media. This is the HTTP protocol that organizes this copying of files. And that is the problem that we face now. I mean, we have not only the problem that digital technology allows for creative work to be infinitely often copied without loss in quality. No, we have even an infrastructure, which is the internet, that has a protocol on top of it that is made to copy things seamlessly and infinitely often. And that is, of course, what the cultural industry struggles with. I mean, the Nyan Cat here, I mean, of course, that is a thing that, like, I don't know, tens of millions of people have watched on YouTube. And I mean, although Google distributes their advertising money to the people who upload things on YouTube, I mean, if you come over a certain threshold, you get money from YouTube to share your creations there. But still, I mean, it is really something that is shared. It's a meme. It is something that people find meaningful to exchange communality. And now the creator of the Nyan Cat, together with Lindsay Howard, creates this token, this NFT, to make it artificially scarce, to make an artificial original from something that never was an original in the first place. I mean, there is, of course, no original in digital art. There is no original if you have a photo print either. So we know from photography that there is kind of the wish of people who have limited editions, but there is no rational. I mean, why would I stop making more prints of my photography? I mean, who cares actually? But that is not how it works. The market requires that there is only, for example, 3 prints and maybe 2 artist prints of this limited edition, of the vintage edition of this photography. And in the same sense, NFTs create artificial scarcity, although in a really crappy technological way. I mean, there is a lot to be said of that in another lecture. How little that actually makes sense, how it is implemented here. Basically, it is a certificate of authenticity that says the owner of this token owns kind of the certificate on this URL, on this particular website. And by that, kind of making the digital thing kind of pseudo-unique. And that's the weird thing. I mean, instead of enjoying and indulging into our wealth of culture that we have, instead of seeing what humanity has on the internet available at their fingertips, the largest library that was ever built, kind of putting that away, locking that away, and making it scarce just to earn more money. And I mean, one of the misconceptions here is, of course, that the art market would actually work like that. I mean, as if the resale value, the commodity value of art would actually be what visual artists would earn, and totally misunderstanding that there is the primary market. I mean, people go into an art gallery and buy a piece of art just because they like it, not because they think that they have a good investment in that. And it's like 99% of the art market is like that people just buy art because they want it and not because they speculate on it. So that's the first thing, that the primary art market versus the secondary art market, which is this arbitrary kind of this new thing of auctioning away art that starts also in the late 19th century and has completely accelerated over the last 20 years with the financialization of art. So this is the first misconception. The second is not understanding that most of art is created in a social and political context. That means, for example, artists get grants, they have residencies, they live in an academic context, so in the context of museums and other institutions that fund them. That has nothing to do with the art being scarce. I mean, some of the best art in the world is just put out there to be seen in the open. So very little art actually has value because it's scarce. Art has its value for having a function in culture, in society and politics, in people's lives. And I think Peter Sunde here really brought that to the point. I mean, creating this kind of work of art that he did. It's a kind of bracelet that you wear, and this bracelet would continuously illegally copy songs, and make copies and copies and copies of the same song, the one song that brought him into jail, and then display how much money that actually destroys in the music industry. And like at the end of the year, I mean, wearing that bracelet, you could see it's more money that the music industry has ever earned in history just by copying that file over and over again. And I think this shows you the absurdity that is behind the idea that culture is somehow tied to the material scarcity of its emanations. So with this, I would give it a rest and invite you to do the readings. There is a lot be said about the commodification, the role of art and the publisher by people who, after the last presidential election, have suddenly a strong say in US politics, and many of that is absolutely right. And I think also that artists are absolutely entitled to be paid for their work. I just think we always should look twice into who gets the money in the end. Is it really the artist, or is it just another kind of institution of the cultural industry?